Hey, welcome back to The Caption Life. In this episode, we're going to be reviewing the many deaths of Laila Starr, and we also find out that ChatGPT is not the greatest for giving you a summary of what happens in a comic book story. Hi, and welcome to The Caption Life, a show for the most casual and dedicated fans of comics and a member of the Comic Watch family. I'm your host, Sean. Join me and discover what the world of comics and graphic novels have to offer. From one-on-one interviews with industry professionals, roundtable discussions with passionate fans, and reviews on the latest comics, TV shows, and movies. Now let's dive right on in. Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning into the show. We're doing a comics review and commentary, and today we're going to review The Many Deaths of Laila Starr from Boom Studios. It was published in 2021. It was written by Ram V, artwork by Filipe Andrade, which I apologize if I'm not pronouncing that correctly, colored by Ines Amaro, and lettered by AndWorld Design. And as you may know, I select the comics we're about to review by taking the recommendation from our guest host, so please welcome to the show, Seth Adrian Romo. Seth is a lifelong fan of comic books and believes there is a comic out there for everyone. He writes for Comic Watch, shares his comic book commentary on Substack, and does his best to get through his ever-growing comic books to read pile. His current goal is to read every issue of Detective Comics, starting with issue number 27. He's a husband, new dad, pet parent, and so-so toy photographer. Seth, welcome to the show. How you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me. And hello, future people and anyone listening to this, from whenever they hear it.
Yes. Yeah. And hopefully, as long as nothing, drastic happens, it should be 2 days from now. We usually record on Sunday, then release it on Tuesday. So,
Awesome. Well, there you go.
So you're a new dad. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. My daughter's turning 8 months in like a week and a half. It's been flying by. It's very surreal for sure.
I bet. No kidding. So since you've been a new dad, what is the biggest life altering thing that's happened to you so far?
Oh my gosh. I would definitely say my anxiety has gone up substantially. That's definitely the biggest one.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Every time, she's doing something, I'm like, is she okay? What is she doing?
Yeah.
Like, why is that there? Let me move it.
Honestly, and you hit it on the nail for me when I became a father the first time. It wasn't until maybe he started crawling or walking that you realize how the rest of the world is pretty much the world's most dangerous playground, because everything could be a weapon given the right circumstance, right?
Oh yeah. Yeah. And of course, they always have to pick the most dangerous thing.
Yeah.
You can have a handful of toys in front of them, but if you leave one of your regular forks there, they're going to go for it,
I know. Yeah. And it's honestly, it's scary, but as long as you're being aware of those things, you're on the right track. So congratulations. That's so great. I'm very happy for you. That's really great to hear. You recently joined the Comic Watch team. I think you've been on the team for about like 4 or 6 months now, or something like that.
Yeah, I joined back in December. Actually, I have you to thank because I saw either a TikTok or a reel, and
Oh
you were
yeah,
like,
yeah.
"Hey, do you like comics?" And I was like, "Yes." And it was like, "Do you like reviewing them?" And I was like, "Yes." And it was like, "Do you want to write like on comics?" And I was like, "Yeah." It's like one of those infomercials, where like
Yeah.
everything was like, uh-huh. And sure enough, I signed up and applied and, emailed back and forth and here we are,
Oh, that's awesome.
It's been fun.
That was probably one of my first videos I did for Comic Watch when they asked me to become the social media manager. And so that's really exciting to hear that one of the first videos we put out there, we got you and a couple other writers to join the team. So that's awesome. So how you been enjoying writing for Comic Watch? Has it what you've been expecting it to be? Is it, something completely different? What's been your experience with the team so far?
I really liked it. The community is really great. I didn't realize just how big of a group it was, until I joined it. Just the sheer number of people on the chat, that goes back and forth. I was like, wow, that's a lot of people on this thing.
Yeah.
But overall, I've really liked it. One thing I really appreciate is there's been a lot of freedom with, being able to kind of pick more of the indie series. I typically tend to lean more towards DC and indie. I love Marvel, don't get me wrong, but I'll usually kind of dive into more indie stuff. And so being able to kind of read them early, review them, and kind of share my thoughts has been has been enjoyable. And then I've been trying to kind of write other articles as well. So most recently, I wrote an article about the first Black owned comic book store in Texas.
Oh,
Um,
that's right. Yeah, I
yeah,
remember you
so that
talking
was
about
really
that.
fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's actually my LCS, Gulf Coast Cosmos. They're a really great group. But it was just fun, to pitch an idea to Matt, the editor, who's been great, and say, hey, I want to write about something, and he's been very supportive. So I've loved it. I keep track of all my articles, and it's getting kind of long, which I'm very excited about. Not a
Yeah.
bad thing to have.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and you know that there is a link where you can pull up on Comic Watch and it'll bring up all of your articles that you've written so far, right?
Definitely. Oh yeah, yeah. I
Yeah.
have all of them on my link tree too.
Oh,
So one of my
good.
friends, yeah. So one of my friends the other day was like scrolling through. He's like, "Man, you've reviewed quite a bit of stuff." I'm like, "Yeah, I've got like 25 things written." I'm like, "That's kind of surprising. I didn't realize I had that many."
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, and because we do it, we try to do something weekly, right? And so it's either a review or a story. And I think that's one of the nice things about Comic Watch is that we have the standard content that we put out there. But anytime we
Hmm.
have an interesting story or idea, like the one that you had for the first Black-owned comic shop in the U.S., our team is usually, really open to doing that because they want to be able to share anything that's related to comics or entertainment or anything like that, and just be able to put something out there. And so that's one of the great things about Comic Watch. And if anyone's listening or watching and they think that they might want to join and write for Comic Watch, I will put a link in the show notes as well too. So that way you can actually go straight to the application. You'll fill it out, then you'll hear from us. I think it takes about a week for us to get back to people. So you'll hear from us pretty quickly in that regard. So awesome. Well, thank you very much. So let's go ahead and talk about your comic book origin story. Every time I have a guest host on the show, I have to ask them what got them into comics. So for you, was it a person? Was it an event? Was it just by happenstance? How did you get started into comics?
I wasn't bitten by like a radioactive spider or anything, so I don't have like that cool of an origin story.
Yeah.
For me, it was watching, for a lot of people, Batman the animated series.
Hmm.
That to me got me into Batman. As you can see behind me, I have a lot of Batman stuff.
Yes. And the
But
Batman toy as there as well
yeah,
too. I really enjoyed that.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. But I'm a little embarrassed to also say I absolutely loved the Ben Affleck Daredevil movie. I didn't
I do
realize,
too. I do
yeah,
too.
it's actually not that bad. And I like Daredevil is probably one of the few Marvel characters that I actually love. Again,
Oh
Marvel's
my
all great,
gosh,
but
we're besties
for
now.
me, yeah, I absolutely love Daredevil because at the time I actually was a camp counselor at the Lighthouse of Blind
Hmm.
here in Houston, and so I was talking to the kids about superheroes, and they were like, "Yeah, it would be really cool if there was a superhero that was blind." And I was like, "Wait a minute, there's a Ben Affleck movie coming out," and I watched it, and I was like, "I really liked it."
Yeah.
I did watch it the other day. There's some elements that maybe don't hold up as much, but
I'm sure. Yeah.
I'm a Ben Affleck guy. Everything he does is great. So it's,
Hmm.
I'm not ashamed to say that I do like that movie. I even
Yeah.
have the director's cut on DVD. And
Oh my
it
gosh.
actually makes more sense because there's a whole side story with, I think, the rapper Coolio. And never thought that would make the story better, but it kind of does.
I've heard that the director's cut is much better, and I think actually, as we're talking about this, let me, I know I'm knocking stuff around here and all that, but I actually have this up here, the Daredevil DVDs. I just happened to come across that I still have from when I
That's
bought them
awesome.
in high school when they came out, and I absolutely love it. But I've heard that the director's cut is what you need to watch because of all the things that you just shared. And I know, just like you said, I love it because I've always loved Daredevil, and that was the first time that we've seen Daredevil on screen.
Hmm.
Yeah, there's some things that was a little bit maybe hokey, but at the same time, I think they're when it came to those movies around that time, I think they were trying to bridge realism with comic book style. And I
Hmm.
think, some of the choices that they made with that movie was trying to bridge those two, right? So like the leather suit, that was something that I think at the time when you think about it, X-Men came out, they had the leather suits, and so leather
Yeah.
was the thing, right? Like it, and it
Yep.
made sense too because leather tends to be a little bit more durable and reasonable and probably more believable in terms of what a superhero probably would have worn as
Yeah.
part of their
Biker
outfit.
gangs wear leather, right?
Yeah, like but yeah, but I love hearing that. So yeah, well great. Thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate that. Um So let's go ahead and start talking about the many deaths of Laila Starr. And let me go ahead and ask you, why did you choose for us to do a review on this book?
Yeah. So for me, I have always really felt that comics are for everyone. I know I put that in my bio, and the
Hmm.
reason why I say that is because I feel like, oftentimes people think of capes and tights when it comes to comic books.
Hmm.
And don't get me wrong, there are phenomenal stories with capes and tights stories.
Hmm.
Um, but I think there's just a whole especially now, a whole growing indie boom of, stories that are being written by, different creators of color, different communities that maybe didn't have as much of a voice as before, and now they're having a whole, explosion of stories that are basically opening up opportunities for people to have this wonderful experience.
Hmm.
And I think the storytelling medium of comic books is just such a phenomenal tool because it's such a beautiful combination of words and art, And so
Hmm.
when you really have a focus on particular words in either dialogue or exposition, and you match that with, just the beauty of art in a panel, you really have this entire experience that you really can't get anywhere else. And
Right.
so part of the reason why I picked this story is because for me, it's one of the comics that if somebody were to say, look, I'm interested in getting into comics. I'm not really into DC Marvel, I'll watch the shows, but I feel like there's so much history and, explanation behind that I just don't really know where I'd want to get in. The Many
Hmm.
Deaths of Layla Starr is actually one of those books that I would recommend to somebody. Um, and for me, it's especially exciting because my wife's actually Indian, the writer's Indian, so my daughter's half Indian.
Oh, there
And
you go.
so, being able to kind of have a comic that when she gets older, I could say, hey, this is kind of a celebration of, your culture and storytelling that links to that. That's something that, to be completely honest, maybe even 10, 15 years ago, I really wouldn't have thought would have been a thing. And so
Hmm.
now that I've really gotten more into comics, and again with this kind of explosion of indie creators or creator owned content, it's just been amazing. So for me, there's that component. It's also just the Many Deaths of Layla Starr is a really beautiful story.
Hmm.
I read it. I've probably read it like 4 times now. It's just that story I go back to, and so I felt like, hey, even if people have read it, they'll probably have something that they hear from this that they're like, oh yeah, I didn't think of that. Or if they haven't read it, it's a perfect opportunity to say, hey, you should check it out.
Yeah, well, and I gotta say, I really excited that you suggested this because for me, first of all, I have never read this book before. So when you
Hmm.
mentioned this, I was like, I have no idea what this book is.
Yeah.
But one things that you and I have talked about is there's definitely a huge understanding of comics being related to superhero comics, but there's
Hmm.
also a huge library of comics that are not superhero related, right? And
Definitely.
the many deaths of Layla Starr is definitely one of those where it's not centered around a superhero. It's centered around a
Hmm.
particular character that we're going to get into here in this episode. But if you're somebody that wants to get into comics and you don't want to get into a superhero comic, or you want to kind of take a break from that, you want to get into something that is a really good story that's not centered around a superhero, this is definitely one of them. And this is a great book that we're going to get into here. And so I really am excited and appreciate and thank you for suggesting this one because this is going to be a really good one for us to dive into. And I'm really excited about that. So
Yeah, definitely.
let's before we get into the synopsis and kind of talking about what the book is about, what the story is about, this is going to be everyone's spoiler warning. So if you have not read this book series and you do not want this to be spoiled for you, this is your warning right now to go ahead and hit pause on this episode and save it for later. Go read the books, and then once you've read them and you're ready to come back and listen to this podcast or this, YouTube video, however you're consuming this right now, come back and then watch it. But we're going to dive right into the many deaths of Layla Starr, and we're going to go ahead and do a synopsis of the story. So there's your warning. Let's go ahead and start talking about giving a brief overview of what the story is about. So I'll be honest, this is going to be the first time I'm doing this on the show. So it'll be interesting to see how Seth and I do this pretty well. If we're able to knock this out of the park, or by the end of it, we're just like, I don't even know if this made any sense. So
I
bear
believe
with
in
us.
us.
Yeah, yeah. I'm glad you have faith in us. That's so great. So let's go ahead and dive in and say that, the story starts off with issue 1. This is a 5-issue series. And issue 1 starts off at this party in Mumbai, where the graduating film class of a university in Mumbai are celebrating at this. It looks like it's like either someone's apartment or it's at a building that's very high, and everyone's enjoying themselves. There's the typical college party that you expect in there. And then there is this woman named Laila Starr, who is one of the graduating students, and she looks like she's kind of, sad or depressed or just not enjoying herself. And then all of a sudden, what you see is she just kind of falls out the window. What's interesting is that, afterwards, the paramedics and everybody got statements from everybody that was at the party. Some people said that she jumped. Some people think that she tripped, but the artwork made it clear that she pretty much jumped, because as she's falling, she doesn't have a sense of panic on her face. She still has a cigarette that she's smoking from the party, like in her mouth while she's falling. So she's still smoking as she's going down. And as she's going down hitting the pavement, the story kind of shifts over to the goddess of death that is in, and maybe Seth, you might have a better understanding of this, but I'm assuming that they're in heaven or some divine plane, because death got called into one of the other deities' office to talk about her future in that realm, basically, right?
Yeah, so it's very loosely based on Hinduism and the
Right.
gods within Hinduism. The good thing is you don't need to know anything about the gods of Hinduism, and so yes, it's alluded that it's Kali, the goddess of death, and she's talking to the equivalent of like the CEO. And so, as you mentioned, she gets called into the office, and that's where he starts talking to her about, well, we have to talk to you about kind of corporate stuff, which is really funny to me that you can't escape this kind of corporate capitalism, even in this kind of afterworld.
Yeah.
And so what he explains to her is, hey, we're letting you go, which is obviously something people don't want to hear. And so, of course, as the goddess of death, she's like, how? People die all the time, every day. And he tells to her, well, immortality is about to be solved. And so because of that, you're basically being laid off.
Right.
And so when that happens, he decides to send her into the body of Laila Starr, the girl who fell off the building. And so from there kind of continues the story.
Right.
And so, that's kind of how it kicks off.
Yeah. Yeah. And the way that issue ends, and there's a lot of, comical things that kind of happens in between. But the way that the issue ends is that when she gets sit down to Laila Starr's body, she pretty much is resurrected. Like Laila Starr is resurrected by the fact that death is in her body, right? Because she is already in the hospital. They already pronounced her dead. Then 20 minutes later, she comes back alive, and Laila Starr is alive again. And so she's basically trying to find the child that is supposed to solve immortality later on in his life. And so she finds the baby that is in the same hospital she is, and she's a goddess of death, so she thinks that this is going to be easy. But as a human being, when she holds the baby and is like trying to end its life, she says, I just can't do it. And so what happens is when she's in there with the NICU or wherever she's at, where all the other babies are at, the other staff at the hospital finds her and say, oh, there she is, go get her. Why does she have a baby? So she runs out and runs away. But as she's running away from the hospital, she actually runs right in front of a truck and gets killed again. So Laila Starr dies twice in one day, and everyone talks about how it's an unfortunate incident. And then the issue ends with her kind of coming back to life 8 years later. And this is a really pivotal point about the whole series, is because every issue actually ends with her dying in some sort of way, and then she wakes up a little bit further. And there's a purpose for that, because every time she wakes up, it kind of gets into a milestone of the child's life who is supposed to solve immortality. And that person is Darius Shaw is his name. Yes. And there's and like I said, it's centered around these monumental moments. And so in issue 2, Darius is 8 years old, and he has this relationship with somebody that works for his family. His family, from what I understand, is a very wealthy family. And so he has a gardener that he develops a friendship with named Bardon. And what's interesting about this is that we talk about how this book is definitely an Indian book, and it's definitely centered around Hinduism. But I think this kind of shines light on how I think this is kind of like how the caste system might work, or at least kind of a reflection on that. Is that right, Seth?
Yeah, I mean, I think from my understanding, there are still socioeconomic differences within the country, and so this kind of
Right.
was a commentary on that.
Right.
Kind of, the boy Darius, as you mentioned, becomes friends with Bartum, but that's obviously not allowed because even
Right.
though it's a completely innocent thing where he's just completely in shock and awe of this giant man who's gentle but also a giant and like
Hmm.
who takes care of the garden, and he sees him very much as this kind of caretaker because he's not from essentially their economic status. He's
Right.
not allowed to essentially be friends with him.
Right.
And so, that's one thing that is interesting because it's kind of that life lesson that he's having to learn throughout the story, that's
Mm.
primarily focused on death, but this kind of being that he's having to learn that life story also about the other elements and tragedies of life, such as you're not allowed to interact with certain people, if you're raised that way, even though he doesn't understand it and rejects it. For him,
Right.
he's like, no, that's not right.
Right.
So,
Yeah. And his parents keep telling him that it's inappropriate for them to do things. Like, I think he wanted to give them a gift or something like that. They said, no, you can't
mhm,
do that. It's inappropriate. And then you find out later that Bardon passes away, I think from cancer or something like that. And his
mhm,
daughter goes to the family and is trying to ask them to, I can't remember if they're asking for money to help cover the funeral costs or something like that.
mhm.
But same thing, Darius wanted to go, and his parents tell him that it wouldn't be appropriate for them to attend. So against, what his parents say, he goes to the funeral, and then Layla is there, just by happenstance. He didn't know that Darius was going to be there, but she's there with Ka the funeral crow. And so they have a really fun and interesting conversation there. But the whole, premise is that they talk to each other, and then she doesn't realize she's talking to Darius until someone, says his name or something like that. And then she's trying to find him in the crowd because he had ran away into the funeral. And then in that process, she drowns, which is still
Mhm.
kind of unclear to me. It looks like it's not drowning in a natural way, but it looks like there's these almost like elemental or deities that's pulling her into the water and kills her that way.
Yeah,
Um,
from my understanding, what they do is they cremate the bodies.
mhm.
Those ashes are then put into a river. And
Okay.
so as the goddess of death, all of those souls are essentially still connected to the water. And so it's kind of their revenge.
Oh,
And they
okay.
pull her under because they're like, well, you're the goddess of death. We're dead. Hey, here's an opportunity. And they drag her under,
That
which is
makes a
kind of
lot of
ironic
sense
because,
now. Yeah.
again, it's a whole celebration of life and death. And yet here she is again dying,
Yeah.
and it's because, she's getting pulled under by the very people she's killed.
Right. Right. Yeah. Okay. So that makes a lot of sense now. So,
Hmm.
um, but yeah, so when she gets killed and drowned, she wakes up again 12 years later. And every time she wakes up, it's because the life deity, like her counterpart basically,
Hmm.
is resurrecting her. She's not supposed to be resurrected. She's supposed to live her remaining life as a mortal. And so when she dies, she's supposed to die, but life keeps bringing her back and making these deals with the other deities to bring her back. So this time it's 12 years later after that instance. She wakes up, life is there, and kind of tells her, what's happened since then. So
Hmm.
that goes into the next issue where Layla meets Darius at a party, and they just have this conversation. And I can't remember. I think she knows it's Darius at that point, but she's just talking to him. And at that point, Darius had just lost his best friend, and his
Hmm.
girlfriend breaks up with him. I think at that same party, right before they started talking,
Hmm.
and so he talks about how that has impacted both of those things. Impact. So we're talking about an actual death of somebody close to him, how that's impacting him, but also this kind of death that we experience in life that is not mortality necessarily, but just a heartbroken memory or heartbroken instance that, the girlfriend breaks up with him, that he's kind of going through this sadness and this sort of pseudo death that we kind of go through in those, cornerstone of part of our lives of having those moments that, makes up humanity basically. Right. So
Definitely.
when that happens, they have this conversation, and then he leaves the party, and somehow that apartment goes up in flames. And I believe it's because Layla like passed out there at that party. She was smoking a cigarette. The cigarette is what actually lit the apartment on fire. That's how she dies. And
Hmm.
then that issue ends with her waking up 16 years later, right?
Yeah.
So the next issue is she wakes up and she goes to this Buddhist temple, and this is kind of a change from what we've seen before, because usually when she wakes up and she starts interacting with Darius, she's interacting with him directly, but this time this is kind of a change of she's interacting and talking to a temple,
Yeah.
as opposed to the crow or things like that. And she learns a little bit about how the temple is connected to this person named Wei, who is a Buddhist, and he's like one of the remaining Buddhists in the area, because again, this is in India, but Wei is from Southeast China, if I remember. And a lot of people are brought over there, but he's one of the remaining people who practice Buddhism and goes to that temple. And so they have that strong connection. So they talk about that, right? And then Laila goes, meets with Darius. And then, Seth, do you want to talk about what happens there when she meets with Darius as an adult at this point?
Yeah. And this whole time, as she's come back, it's essentially the same age, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so even though Darius is getting older, Layla's still kind of that 20-something-year-old individual. And so when she goes to Darius and talks with him, he knows who she is. Like at this
Mm-hmm.
point, obviously he doesn't remember her when he was a baby, but when he was, at 8 years old, he remembers meeting her at the beach. When
Mm-hmm.
he was at the party, he remembers seeing her again, and she looks familiar. And there's that moment where he's like, I kind of know who you are, but I don't.
Right.
And now that he's older, he's also bitter because he's going to be the discoverer of immortality, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so at this point, he's older. He's already kind of had his progress in the scientific community, in terms of kind of what he's going to find. He hasn't discovered immortality yet, but unfortunately, he has lost his wife, so he only has his son. And so again, this is now the additional time where he's experienced death, and Layla shows up. And
Right.
so he's absolutely furious with her. He yells at her. He's obviously very frustrated because for him, like, she just brings about death. But the irony is that she's not actually doing it. She's just showing up when it happens.
Right.
And so he knows he knows, not that she's the goddess of death, but he knows that essentially she's connected to it somehow.
Mm-hmm.
And so it kind of motivates him to stop her. And he even makes a comment, like, I'm gonna keep this from happening again. And so that's kind of where that issue wraps up. Except this time when she dies, she goes back to the temple, very upset because obviously, he berated her and he was very mad at her. And so, she hadn't experienced that. And she's, as the goddess of death, she's truly coming to terms with, what it is to be immortal, to experience loss, and what that loss looks like for other humans.
Mm-hmm.
And so when she goes to the temple, unfortunately, this giant storm comes in, washes away the entire temple, and that's where she dies, and that's where that issue ends.
Right. Yes. And that's just like you said, it's a really bittersweet moment for Layla, because just as you said, this is the first time where she realized the gravity of the impact of death on mortals.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because Darius had not found a solution to immortality yet until this moment happened. So the thing that she's trying to stop happening, she's actually the motivation for her as a person, not so much her as the idea of deity, but her as Laila Starr. It ends up being the motivation for him to try to solve immortality at that point, right? So
Definitely.
yeah, so it ends with her dying, with the temple being, fled out, and Wei had died as well too. When the comic book, when issue number 4 started out, we find out that Wei had passed away, later on that day or something like that. And so the temple goes away, Layla passes away, and then she wakes up 28 years later, which at this point that makes Darius around 64 years old, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the last issue of the story opens up with a girl finding a dog near death with a broken leg. She takes the dog to the crazy old man in town that she has said that, if there is something that needs to be fixed when it comes to animals, everybody takes it to this person. Turns out it's Darius. Darius is the person that, he always says he will always try to save whatever. But it always has to be animals. It can never be humans.
Mm-hmm.
And so when that happens, Layla shows up at the house to meet with him. And then then she tells him her story eventually and says that, the whole reason why she's been meeting with him is because he's trying to stop him from solving immortality. And then he reveals to her that he actually found out a long time ago how to solve immortality. But when he solved it, he decided to put it away and just experience life, because at that moment, he had given so much of his life to try to solve this that he ended up being isolated from his son. His son, wouldn't talk to him anymore because he basically stopped talking to his son. He put his whole life into this that he stopped living, essentially. So when he finally solves immortality, he goes out and lives for that one day and realizes what it means to be human. And that part of the meaning of being human is the fact that life comes with death, and that's what gives it meaning, basically. So he has this, he has the formula, he knows how to solve it, but he put it in a shoebox and puts it away. And so he tells Laila that pretty much his time is coming to an end, that he's going to be passing away in like the next 4 or 6 months. He finally calls his son and tells him what happens. His son comes back home and he's there while Darius passes away. But he tells Laila where she can find the formula to immortality and basically tells her, do with it what you will. And so Laila shows up at the beach with Life, and basically they have this whole conversation, and she decides to send the formula for immortality out into the ocean for it to be lost forever, but not because she wants to stop immortality from happening, but she realizes that this is a necessary part of life. And so she doesn't even go back, that we've seen, as her deity as death back into the divine plane. She stays there on Earth with her counterpart Life and kind of lives out her day there, basically. So that's the story, and hopefully we summarize it for everybody pretty well. I think that was about 10 minutes, but yeah, that's essentially the whole story, basically. So
yeah,
I'm going to sidetrack us a little bit, Seth, but I wanted to let you know that before this episode, I was trying to put out some of the talking points of the summary for this. And again, I'm trying to figure out a way to condense this because I don't want to be, taking too long. But everybody's been hearing about the new AI tool called ChatGPT, right? Have you used this tool at all before?
I have to play around with it a bit. I forgot what I looked up. I asked it to come up with like a good schedule to like try to manage time, and it gave me like this really detailed like timeline and like down to the minute, and I was like, this is overwhelming. It's a really cool tool.
Yeah.
But yeah, I feel like it's something that's definitely coming along. I've heard there's a lot of uses for it. I get TikToks on it all the time of hey, here's how you can use ChatGPT. Like I'm gonna find a purpose for it one day. I don't know yet though. But yeah, it's exciting.
Yeah, and I thought when I was working on this episode, I thought maybe ChatGPT can actually reduce some time for me by telling me how to summarize this, a little bit succinctly. So I went over to ChatGPT and gave it the question, give me an issue by issue summary of the comic series, The Many Deaths of Laila Starr. That's what I gave it. Okay. The first paragraph was pretty spot on. It says, The Many Deaths of Laila Starr is a 5-issue comic book series written by Ram V and illustrated by Filipe Andrade. The series was published by Boom Studios from April to August 2021. Spot on, right? Then it says, here's an issue by issue summary of the series. It says, issue 1, The Offer. Now, I can't remember if that's the actual name of the issue, but later on it says something like issue number 2, The Replacement. Issue number 3, The Confrontation. These are not the actual titles of those issues, at least not the ones that I read. Yeah. And so issue number 1 says, the first issue introduces Laila Starr, a woman who has lived for thousands of years and is tired of immortality. She works as a clerk in the Mumbai Death Registry office and is approached by Death himself with an offer to become the new Death and end her endless cycle of rebirth. But to do so, Laila must find a suitable replacement for herself. Not at all what happens in the story. No. And then later on, the second issue says, Laila sets out to find a suitable replacement for herself. Of course, she's not doing that. Meeting with various individuals who had come close to death but were ultimately spared. That didn't happen. She eventually settles on a young boy named Mir, M-I-R, which there is no Mir in the story at all, who she believes is potential for the next step. Issue 3, Laila and Mir confront the current Death, who is reluctant to give up his power. Laila engages in a battle with Death and emerges victorious, taking on the mantle of Death herself. Like this is
Wow.
I know this is just so off base. So it was really interesting. It's this is the first time I've used ChatGPT. So obviously in terms of comics, it has a long ways to go. I don't
Yeah.
know how it got the overall summary right, but then the issue by issue is completely wrong. No idea how that happened. So if you're worried about Chat GPT or Skynet or anything like that, I think we are pretty safe. But for me, unfortunately, I can't use Chat GPT to help me with these podcast
Yeah,
episodes.
and here we go with the shameless plug. See, that's why you guys need to go to Comic Watch to get all your issue reviews. Because if you go to
Exactly.
Chat GPT, it's gonna completely butcher
Right. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So yeah, that's why you want to check us out. So before we dive into our overall thoughts about the series, I want to share what some of the listeners' thoughts about the mini deaths of Laila Starr. From Twitter, Anthony Bergamini at Antman0052, who's also a Comic Watch writer, says this book is a fantastic exploration of death from a perspective that's outside of a Western/European influence. Also from Twitter, Chris Evans at that Chris Evans 0 says, I adore this book. It was really the first indie title that caught my attention and showed me that these books could be just as good, if not better, than the standard superhero fare, which I completely agree. This is a
it.
fantastic book. The story is beautiful and emotional with some unique top-notch art. It truly hits on every level. And then in our Discord server for Illuminacasters, and again, if you're interested in joining, I'll put the link in the show notes as well too. Joe Loves Comics said the book has such lush, flowing poetic writing that makes it such a compelling and delightful read with beautiful art and deep emotional moments that make it incredibly fascinating to read through as the book goes on, especially how it explores the idea of life, death, mortality, and what that all means each issue. Well worth all the praise and a read if anyone hasn't already. These are all spot on reviews. I completely agree with what everybody says here. Seth, your overall thoughts about the book, about the writing, the artwork, anything that you haven't touched on yet that you want to share about just the series as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I really appreciate is it's a complete story. There is a little bit of ambiguity there, kind of with the ending, but that's kind of the whole point. Is immortality really isn't the main topic of the book. It's kind of what you do with life, and it's kind of that cliche of take every day at a time, every moment's sacred and special, and those are cliches for a reason, but it's kind of that reminder of like and there's even a quote in there, like every heartbeat you take is a rejection of death. And
Right.
I absolutely love that. I love the fact that, it talks about death, which can be so morbid and obviously very traumatic and an awful thing. But again, death can't exist without life. And so what does that life look like? How do you celebrate it? How do you, experience it and cherish it and focus kind of on the actual living and not just trying to escape death. Because the thing is as we saw with Darius, he spent his whole life trying to fight death, and the cruel irony is his life was awful. He had the solution, and he realized it wasn't worth it. And yes, obviously death is again traumatic, but just kind of focusing on what makes life great. And just kind of that celebration of it, I think for me it's just astounding. And every time I read it, I kind of take something away from it, kind of, just depending on the mindset I'm in. When I read it again, for us to talk about it, especially now as a new dad, I think about, okay, I have to think about this little life, that I'm responsible for. How do I make sure to appreciate every moment, every day as my daughter's, before in front of my eyes, she's twice as big. She's sitting up now, and I'm just like, I have to allow myself and remind myself to pause and remember those moments. And again, this is why I love comic books so much, is you can't really get this kind of story somewhere else. You could get the synopsis of the story, but just this is meant for the reader to experience it and get what they can from it, maybe what they need from it. So that's definitely something I love about it.
Right. No, I completely agree. And I think when you were talking about how it had some of those quotes in there, that was in issue 5, the final issue of the story arc. And correct me if I'm wrong, are those passages from the Bhagavad Gita that they pulled in, or is that from something else? Do you know?
I'm not 100% sure on that one,
Yeah.
actually.
And it was really interesting because we haven't seen that in any of the previous issues, but it's like how Darius is going through some of these really profound reflections on his life that these passages kind of show up in there, that corresponds with what's going on. So I thought the writing was very well done because just as you said, it's definitely a reflection of life and death and how we give meaning to both of those. And you can't really have one without the other. But I also appreciate how it wasn't just talking about death as a mortality life ending event, but also things that happens in life that is kind of what I call like a pseudo death, basically.
Hmm.
Correct. It's something that happens to us that um has a negative impact, or is a death of the soul, basically, of something that
Hmm.
happens, whether it's someone else's death or some sort of action that happens that makes part of us die a little bit on the inside. And I think that's what the writing does. It juxtaposes those things in a lot of those critical moments in Darius's life for us to look at, not just from someone who's dying. So, for example, in issue 2, it wasn't just his best friend dying that was the gardener, but it's also just like what we talked about, him realizing that there is this unjust world that he's living in, and that he can't, just have fun and be with his friend because of some of the infrastructures that life has placed between them, right? And so every
Yeah.
issue not just looks at someone who has died, but what has happened in that life of his that has also kind of killed his soul a little bit as well too. And so that's what I really love about the writing with this. The artwork was also very good. It's really interesting because it's not the kind of artwork that you see. It has a lot of the realism in there, but it's a lot of pastel colors.
Hmm.
It's also a lot of symbolism and what I say, like contortions of the body to kind of give more of a not a realistic physical presence or representation of the person, but more of an embellish what that person kind of resembles for the eye of the beholder, basically. So
Yeah.
going back to Badran had like a really long, lanky, unproportional body in some of the panels, not in all of them, but there's some things when he's working in the garden, he has like very long torso, very long arms. That's not human at all by whatsoever. But I think it gives the idea of just how he was greater than or bigger than life
Hmm.
for Darius. And so the artwork, I think, really does a great job of trying to represent between the mortal and divine planes of not just what we see physically, but also spiritually in these people. And I thought the artwork just did a phenomenal job of representing that.
Yeah,
So,
and it's definitely it. I feel like it does a good job at being, very minimal when it needs to, focusing on the
yes.
colors, allowing the colors to kind of take precedent with the line work, kind of giving you an understanding of what you're looking at. Like
Hmm.
for example, right on the first page, it's a whole splash of what I imagine is Mumbai, and
Right.
and there's not like there's enough detail where it's impressive, of course, but it's also just minimal enough that you're really appreciating the colors and the tones and kind of that gradient combination between it. That first page in itself is just like really beautiful. And
Right.
it's just a city, you know.
Right. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So those are overall thoughts. Let's talk about a key or favorite moment of ours from the comic. What for you in this whole 5 issue run, what was a favorite moment of yours or key moment for you that you said, this is a moment that really makes up the story arc for you?
I think for me, issue 5 really ties everything together. I thought one thing I thought was hilarious is how the answer to immortality is kept in shoebox.
Mhm.
He didn't keep it in a bank vault. He didn't write it down and store it in some, fancy journal. He put it in God knows what, and then put that in a shoebox, and then tucked that away into a closet. And I
Right.
and I kind of love that, that kind of talking about a heavy subject of life and death, but
Mhm.
also kind of giving that kind of lightness to it. Like again, immortality is just in a shoebox. And I love the fact that Darius just thought it was so funny that this whole time Layla's been trying to stop him, and she missed her window.
Mhm.
Like she completely missed it, and he's like, "Yeah, I already did it." Like, and that to me, I thought was just really funny about it, is because that's kind of the whole point. They're supposed to go on their respective paths and learn to either appreciate life or appreciate death. Um, and that's kind of the whole point of it, is like that lesson along the way and kind of what you take from it. And so for me, I just thought, issue 5, just I absolutely love that part. Again, just the shoebox I thought was hilarious.
Yeah. Well, and for me, it's kind of the same thing, because what I hear you saying is that the shoebox with the immortality formula in there
Hmm.
is, when we think of things that we really value, we usually think about it being in some sort of secure vault, or something that has, a huge, clearly huge value, or, maybe something that's a little bit more glamorous than just a shoebox. For me, issue 4 is kind of like that, where we get the death of Wei and Temple. But this is, again, this is the first time where death is interacting with an object as some sort of representation of life and death, basically. Because all the issues before, and then the issue 5, there wasn't an object that she was really interacting with that represents
Hmm.
that. But for me, I think this was really profound, because we always think about life being something more organic, or comes with animals or humans, especially when we think about death as well too. um but life and death can also go beyond some of those physical representations. It can be
Hmm.
an object, and not just a living being in that sense as well too. So when something gets destroyed, and there's a death of some sort of physical thing, maybe it's a monument, or something that is stand the test of time for like 400 or 500 years, and then it gets brought down, like this temple here, right? Or it could be some sort of artifact that somebody has, it's really important to them, that they end up losing. So those things, I think, was really profound, and that life and death kind of goes beyond just beings, but also physical representations, and how the temple being personified as an extensive way is how objects are in our daily lives as well too. And that we all have something that we kind of hold on to ourselves, that is a physical representation or meaning of something that we love or cherish, or things like that, right?
Hmm.
Like, for example, we've had 2 dogs that passed away like the last 2 years, and it's been really hard on our family,
Yeah.
especially the one dog that's really beloved by my son. And we still have artifacts of him that we keep, because that's kind of a memory that we have of that pet. And that's just how I think the temple is kind of like a great representation of that, because up until this point we didn't really see that. It's all in people, but then we have like the physical object that also personifies that. Um, Seth, for you in this story arc, what's something that you wish the author or the artist would have done differently?
So I, that's actually kind of a challenge. I don't really feel like there was a lot that I found, like I didn't really find any problems with it.
Right.
I think one of the challenges for me was kind of, I think around issue 3, it started feeling just a little formulaic.
Hmm.
And I think it's kind of part of this story was released in 5 issues, so it took place obviously over 5 months. And I do think this is one of those stories that does read better from beginning to end, back to back to back.
Right.
And so for me, by issue 3, I think that's where I felt like the pacing was kind of getting a little bogged down. I understand the purpose of, talking about Darius's life when he was a little bit older and kind of that pivotal moment. But by that time, I was like, okay, she comes back, she meets Darius, she dies again. I'm like, all right, what what's how is issue 4 going to be different? And that's kind of like what you mentioned. I liked how issue 4, the way in which she dies is very different. Her interaction with Darius is very different.
Right.
And so I feel like that kind of middle ground was where I felt like it was a little weaker. But again, I like this book so much. I don't really have a lot of complaints about it.
Right. Yeah. No, and I understand, because I think, just like you said, issue 1, issue 2, issue 3 kind of follow that same formula. And when it comes to Hinduism, they talk about the cycles of life that
Hmm.
happens there, and I think that was a little bit symbolic with that. And then, just like you said, issue 4 kind of breaks up that formula, and so yeah, that makes a lot of sense. For
Yeah.
me, same thing with you. I didn't have a whole lot that I thought they would have changed or like to see change. The only thing that I kept asking myself is I wanted to know more about how and why Layla kept getting brought back. Like, I know Life was responsible for doing that, but it wasn't quite clear to me why he was doing that, right? Like, we know that he was doing it because death is trying to, stop immortality from happening. But it wasn't clear to me why death was doing that, other than he just has this, lifelong partnership with her, or why it was those kind of years, because those years, it was formulaic in terms of, it was 8 years and 12 years, and then, 26 years or whatever.
Mhm.
And so I was really curious to know, why it was those long intervals and why it was kept getting longer and longer. And there was an issue where he said, every time he went back to the deities to kind of make a deal with them, every time they were, less and less happy about it, but somehow he still convinced them. I wanted to know more of the background behind that, in terms of, did it take a long time for them to resurrect somebody, and that,
Mhm.
why was it so long in between? And I get it's kind of a plot device a little bit, because it's trying to center it around these critical moments around somebody's life. But I think it would have been great to know what was kind of the rationale on that other end, rather than we're doing this so it fits into the person's life in there. So that's my only criticism. But at the end of the day, it doesn't take away from the story. So I'm with you. It's kind of hard to find something, but I know that was something that kept popping in my mind, is I want to know more as to how and why, these intervals, why, she kept getting brought back to life, yada, yada. So,
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point. Ironically, I guess the whole bureaucracy of the system, you bring up a good point. I didn't even think of that. How exactly does that function?
mhm,
How did Ram V think of, if life was having to kind of make deals with someone, what kind of deals was he having to make? What are the expectations? Are they the ones determining the years? So yeah,
right.
you bring up a good point. I feel like that's somewhere that maybe there could have been a little bit of explanation of that, even just a few panels. That probably
Right.
would have been good because you're right. It's so interesting at the beginning that you see Death going to the top floor with
Mhm,
the head honcho. The head
mhm.
honcho has an assistant. Life is one of the employees. Death is one of the employees. And the whole process is very corporate. So like, how does that structure work? How is it supposed to? So yeah, I think that's a very good point. Yeah. See, now I'm bummed. I don't know what that is.
Maybe I shouldn't shadow that glass ceiling for you. um, let's end this with another key moment for us for the comic. What was another key moment for you, or something pivotal for the story arc that you really resonated with the story?
I think the other thing that I really loved about the book, aside from the overall message and like the many different themes behind it, again goes back to issue 5. I loved that Darius was, and I feel like it was kind of implied, was only saving animals. Which, if you
Right.
think about it, animals are like animals and babies, basically, like are like the most innocent things out there, right?
Mhm.
Their whole mindset is basically like they're living, they're existing, and his whole house is filled with like cats and dogs, and everybody knows take the sick animal to him. And I felt like it was kind of implied that he was only using immortality for that purpose, but he wasn't
Right.
going to admit it that he actually was using it.
Right.
Um, but I absolutely love that he was taking care of animals, and his whole place was filled with them. And just the fact that it's like this, like, oh, you have the crazy cat lady, and now you have the crazy guy who saves all of them, and you don't know why they have so many. And I thought that was kind of a fun play on that, is his whole place is just filled with them. That to me, I thought was really funny, and kind of a, oh yeah, he's going to use it, he's just not going to really tell you.
Yeah. You know what's interesting is that was also maybe for 50% my favorite moment as well too, because I wanted to bring up not only that where Darius is at, but just like we talk about, is how animals and babies are represent that innocence of life. And I think that little girl is also that representation of the
Hmm.
innocence of life, and how the start of issue 5, that is the ending issue of the story arc, starts off with that innocence of life, which is what started this whole story to begin
Yeah.
with, is the birth of Darius, right?
Hmm.
And so I think it shines a really interesting light on going back to how life, we start off in there being innocent, and how we want to kind of go back to that innocence, and that cycle starts again. And again, this is based around the Hindu faith, and not that it's unique to Hinduism by any means, but Hinduism definitely does. And let me kind of preface this by saying that I'm not an expert on Hinduism. I'm not a practicing Hindu at all, and never really practiced it. But I have taken a couple courses on it, so I kind of know a couple of things. So it's not just something I'm just assuming here. This is I took a couple philosophy courses about Asian philosophies, and we study, Hinduism. We actually read the Bhagavad Gita and everything. So I know a couple of things, but the thing with Hinduism is that it definitely kind of hits home about how life is a cycle of things. And I love how this story reflects that on both a religious but secular way, in terms of how life is a big cycle. We start innocent, we live life not very, innocent, that we learn the hard core truths and experience death on multiple levels. And then by the end of life, we try to go back to that innocence of life that we start off with as when we're children. So I agree. I absolutely love that issue 5 and how they kind of focus on that idea of that theme in the whole series. And that's how they end it. Yeah. So that is the many deaths of Laila Starr. Before we wrap up this episode, we always like to talk about the comics that we're reading. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to share what some of our community members are reading. And then once I've shared that, Seth and I are going to share our own books that we're going to be reading as well, too. So to start off with, let's talk about, I'm going to share what Comic Watch members have shared with me on the current comics that they're reading. So Tyler Davis said that they might dive into Ann Nocenti's Daredevil this week, or give Sandman a reread. Have an itch for older comics right now, and those two are grabbing my attention. And then, Chad Burdett, who's our content manager, said not a comic per se, but started Act 3 of Audible's The Sandman, really digging it, and will have to read the actual comic series. Matt Meyer, who is our editor-in-chief, said Doctor Strange by Roger Stern, which I'm glad that's all he said, because he said anything more, I would have dropped that, because as everybody knows, I'm not a Doctor Strange fan. Gabrielle DeJesus said Boys Run the Riot Volume 1 by Kato Gaku. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that name correctly, so I apologize. But Gabriel said it was really good and approached the me being trans in a natural but almost introductory way. Characters are fun and engaging. Plot is interesting. I immediately ordered the rest of the series. And then B-Rats said the post-Infinite Crisis DC universe of books, of which I have an almost ungodly amount. Some of the biggest thumbs up are the Busiek, John Superman, Teen Titans, Justice League of America, Green Lantern books, and Justice Society of America. John's was at his peak here. And then our Discord server, Matt Martin from the Panel to Panel podcast, said a few of the fun ones from this past week was Strange 1, just finished clear from the Comixology original by Scott Snyder and Francis Manapul, Wolverine and Black Cat, Claws mini run. And then Ken from the ODPH podcast said they're reading the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2 by Parrot and Mora from Boom Studios, two fandoms coming together and delivering on one hell of an adventure. And then on Twitter, we have at Bizarro Fett said, this week, One Bad Day, Ra's al Ghul was my favorite comic. I'm a sucker for Tom Taylor, and he freaking nailed the story. And Ivan Reis absolutely killed it too. And then Pop Culture Productions said, Radiant Red, Rogue Sun, Supermassive, Radiant Black, Volume 3. Getting myself caught up a bit. Love the universe that they were building. And the only downside so far is some of the panels of Radiant Red. Often Satomi looked like a child, is what they is the only downside that they said for that. So all those things that was said, Seth, was there anything that stuck out to you as something that you thought was really interesting or you agreed with or anything like that from what?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, it's weird. In my opinion, Daredevil has never had a bad run. So whoever is going back and reading a previous run, I mean, you can't go wrong with that. Clear, I know that's a Scott Snyder Comixology original. I enjoyed that one. It felt very Blade Runner-esque. Kind of that mixture of, augmented reality, artificial intelligence, very sci-fi. So yeah, it's definitely one that when I read it, I thought it was enjoyable. And yeah, the Radiant Black series has been really fun. I think I've only gotten to volume 3. At this point, it's one of those series I'm like, I'm just going to wait for an omnibus to come out so I can just fly through the whole thing. And I'm just waiting for them to make a TV show of it, because it's definitely very much like what a true Power Rangers fan could make their own series without it feeling Power Ranger-esque.
Right.
So I love that. So yeah, those are some great selections, but those are the three that definitely stood out to me.
Yeah, and I agree. Daredevil, there's only one run that I was kind of okay with, but even then I would still read it. So I agree with you that a lot of the Daredevil runs have been really spot on. In terms of the Massiverse that Pop Culture Productions was talking about, I haven't read those books, but I just started reading No One, and it's a fantastic series I absolutely love. I don't know if they're connected to the other ones. I think it is, since people have been talking about the Massiverse, but I might be getting that confused because I know that's a little bit newer to me, and that actually Kim from the ODPH podcast had mentioned that to me. But the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle crossover, I actually just got the trade paperback collection for the first series and started picking up the single issues for the second series. And the only reason why I did that is because I saw the variant cover of Kevin Eastman and Freddie Williams and what they did with Raphael and the Green Power Ranger. And the cover alone, I was just like, that looks fantastic. I love Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. It's one of my favorite properties. I grew up with Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, so it's not a comic book that I subscribe to, but I watched the show and it has a special place in my heart. The crossover never really interested me, but when I saw that variant cover, it piqued my interest. And just that alone, I said, I got to go and read this now. Even if I end up reading all of it and decided that it was not worth my time, at least I got the cover that I really enjoyed and started collecting the Eastman Williams variant covers. But, you know, I've heard nothing but great things about that crossover as well, too. So I'm not concerned about that at all. So thank you to everybody who shared what they're reading this week. Seth, what are you currently reading?
So I actually just finished The Last Ronin.
How'd you like that?
Oh, it was great. I won't go to spoilers, but it's been on my reading list, that really long reading list for the longest time, and I finally was like, you know what? I'm gonna take a minute. I'm just gonna read it, and it was awesome. Absolutely loved it. I thought it was great. I know the Lost Years have just come out. I think issue 2 just got released, so I'm gonna have to go find them. And then aside from that, like I mentioned, I'm trying to read Detective Comics from the very beginning to current, which has been a very big feat. Batman's kind of different, kind of douchey in his early years. So that's been a fun experience. And then aside from that, I just got the omnibus for Bitter Root, so I'm gonna try to read through that because I read the first 2 volumes and they were great. So I'm excited to see the whole series in its completion.
Nice. Yeah, you know, the Last Ronin is always going to have a special place in my heart because that was the first Ninja Turtle comic series that I've read. I grew up with the cartoons and the movies, absolutely love them, but I never read a comic book issue of the Ninja Turtles until The Last Ronin came out, and absolutely love it. And so I'm very excited about C2E2 that's coming up in Chicago that I'm going to, because Kevin Eastman's going to be there. I'm going to have him sign the first book of The Last Ronin and tell him that story of how this got me into the Ninja Turtle comic series. Even though I've been a huge fan of the property, this is the one I want him to sign because that's what got me into it. So I absolutely love that series. I've been collecting the Lost Years as well, too. And recently Paramount just announced that they're working on a game version that's supposed to be like God of War, that's going to be based on The Last Ronin. So I cannot wait. It's a seller right now. They're doing a fantastic job with that property, and I don't think you can go wrong with that. So I absolutely love hearing that. That's great.
Oh yeah, and the IDW TMNT series as a whole is really great. I think I'm on volume 5 of that, but a friend of mine recommended it to me, and I was like, okay, I'm like, I've always loved Ninja Turtles, so I'm like, let me see how the comic is. And sure enough, I read volume 1 and I was like, wow, this is really good. I'm like, it has no business being that good. So yeah.
And it's been going on since like 2010 or 2012. Like it's a continuous, like it's probably one of the longest running series out there that I've seen. And Stephanie, not Williams, but Stephanie, oh my gosh, I feel so bad that I'm escaping her name now. But the person who is writing it, I think she's been on it since issue 1. So the fact that she's been on it from the beginning is just phenomenal. And I've been collecting the current issues as well too. I think I started at City of War Volume 1, so I haven't read anything before that, but I agree with you. It's just a phenomenal series. It's definitely a bigger world than what we've seen in any of the animations or movies that we've seen so far, and it's phenomenal. I'm still kind of getting caught up on that, but it's a phenomenal world that they've been building in the current series.
Definitely.
I absolutely love it. Yeah. For me, I am reading 2 series right now. One of them is Age of Apocalypse, because that's actually a future episode that we're going to be working on with actually Kim from the ODPH podcast. He's going to be coming on to talk about Age of Apocalypse. And apparently there's a lot of, it's an X-Men book. So first of all, if it's an X-Men book, that means that there's going to be a lot of the side stories that they put out currently, like what they have with the X-Men books. But this one with Age of Apocalypse, there's, I think, 10 issues that comprise of the main story of Age of Apocalypse. And then there's all these other side stories. So we're going to focus on the 10, and then we might dive into some of the other side stories as well, too. So I'm going to start working on that. And then I'm also working on X-Men Red that has been released the last couple of years. And I have the trade paperbacks for Volume 1 and Volume 2. I haven't started it yet. I think in the previous issue, I said that everybody from Comic Watch had said that that's the one to read, that they absolutely love with X-Men. So that is one I'm going to be starting this week as soon as I get caught up with my daily pulls, which I have a stack building up right now because I was on vacation. So
you never run out of things to read as a comic book reader.
That's true.
That list just gets more and more bigger and more overwhelming sometimes.
I know, because you read more, but the more you read, the higher that pile still gets.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's how you know when you become part of that world of comics, is when your non-read pile has become bigger than what you've read. So yeah. Well, Seth, thank you very much for coming on the show to talk about the many deaths of Laila Starr. I appreciate you suggesting this. This is one of my favorite books now, especially if it's one that people are asking, what book should I read that's not a superhero comic book? This is at the top of my list because it's just a phenomenal and beautiful book. So thank you very much for joining the show to talk about this and do a deep dive on this. Before I let you go, where can everybody find you and your work online?
Yeah, so my hub is basically on Instagram. I could be found at Pages, Panels, and Figures. I like to link all of my Comic Watch articles. Like I said, my So-So toy photography is all there. So pretty much everything I work on comic book related is all comprehensive and put on there. So yeah, you can find me on Instagram. Be sure to give me a follow, and I'll do so right back. The comic book community is really fun, especially on Instagram. I every now and then I think of that meme from Arrested Development where it's like, there are dozens of us, and it's always cool to see a hashtag. And I'm like, wow, there's a lot of people, involved on this, app, talking about comics. So yeah, Pages, Panels, and Figures is where you'll find me.
And I'll make sure to put that link in the show notes as well, too. So Seth, thanks again for coming on the show, and have a great rest of your week.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been fun. Have a great week.
And that wraps up another episode of The Caption Life. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button. You can follow us on social media at Caption Life. For more information about us and all of our previous episodes, visit thecaptionlife.com.